Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be amongst you. Tim's asked me to speak on the subject British federalism and the European Union, devolving answers for Britain challenges. But first, it being the 1st of March and my former constituency being Anglesey Ynys Môn, I must offer you Dydd Gwyl Dewi Hapus in the language of heaven, or Happy St. David's Day in English. As the chair of the World Federalist Movement, Institute for Global Policy, for more than 3 decades, and a member of the Board of Federal Union, I've had much time to ponder the issue of federalism, both internationally and how it might apply domestically. I was privileged to have the late Sir Peter Ustinov as a friend, who in his articles in The European, now defunct, and elsewhere, he referred to federalism as the F word in British politics. There is no doubt that to some it is a toxic idea. Sadly, rather like the attitude towards electoral reform, it is regarded as something suspiciously foreign and not for us. Yet federalism, far from being top-down government, is essentially bottom-up, with decisions taken at the lowest level possible and those referred upwards only where necessary, thereby ensuring maximum citizen involvement. This is the fundamental principle of subsidiarity to which all truly democratic constitutions should aspire. Now, the British have a history of devising significant constitutional changes and exporting them to other countries, but not having the same enthusiasm for them at home. Conservative lawyer Sir Thomas Hare in the 19th century is the architect of proportional representation, but it has taken more than a century to apply it in the UK, and still not for Westminster, despite all other legislative bodies and executive functionaries like metropolitan mayors created in my lifetime being elected under this system. Similarly, it was a set of papers from British federalists which inspired Altiero Spinelli to write the Ventotene Manifesto, making him the intellectual author of the European Community. Our own constitutional changes have been far more haphazard and effected as a result of crisis or compromise rather than in a planned manner. It has left us not only with an unwritten constitution, but one that in many respects looks improbable and almost unworkable on paper. It is doubtful that anybody devising a constitution for a new modern state would include an hereditary monarchy as its head of state. It is even more unlikely that any bicameral system would have its revising chamber unelected and based on ancient privilege. I do appreciate that reform is now party policy of the major political parties and that a small number of hereditary peers are now elected from among their number to serve as legislators. But frankly, progress rather than principle has been very slow. My proposition, therefore, is that we are moving inexorably towards a federal state in the UK, but that the obstacles to its achievement are formidable. We should remember that in Europe, Austria, Belgium and Germany are federal states, and in Denmark, Finland, France and the Netherlands, there are parts which have autonomy. In Italy, there has been devolution of powers to the 20 regions, and in Spain, there are, of course, the autonomous communities. Most contemporary students of federalism view the EU itself as a federal system, while, of course, Switzerland has long been a confederation. The most populous democracy, India, and the most powerful democracy economically and militarily, the USA, in the world are federal states. There are roughly 25 federal countries in the world today, which together representing some 40% of the world's population. But in living memory, however, the UK arguably has embarked on a journey of continued devolution, if not towards full federalism. It has created the Northern Ireland Assembly, Scottish Parliament, Welsh Senedd, each with devolved powers, and we now have seen, again within recent times, devolution of powers to elected mayors of conurbations. All those new institutions have been elected under proportional systems. Scottish local government is now elected on the single transferable vote, and in Wales, individual local authorities are able to move to SDV under recent Welsh legislation. For us, however, the dead hand on the tiller is that of the Treasury, and a failure to provide fiscal and financial devolution, but more of that in a moment. Time and your patience does not admit here of an examination of how existing federal systems came into being. Each has its own history, but it is generally true that mostly they came together as independent or semi-independent pre-existing states and formed themselves or were unified into a federal system, keeping a great deal of the autonomy of each state in its previous incarnation, rather than a top-down approach of breaking up a unitary state into federal parts, which would be the order for the UK. Prior to recent devolution, the UK has always been regarded as a unitary state, and still major functions of government emanate exclusively from Westminster: international treaties, foreign policy, overall economic policy, to name but a few. And although King Edward I conquered northern Wales and made it a principality in 1284, it was not incorporated with England until the reign of Henry VIII with the Act of Union in 1536. For Scotland, despite the merger of the crowns in James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, the actual merger of the countries did not occur until 1707, largely through Britain buying out Scotland after the disastrous adventure into the Darien scheme. It's arguable that had the Irish Home Rule Bill been implemented, as it was interrupted by the First World War, then Ireland might still be part of the UK. I mentioned local government finance. No truly federal structure can be sustained unless there is a substantial degree of fiscal and financial autonomy. Inherent in accountability at any level of government is its ability to raise and spend money. The fact that so often local government elections are used as a proxy for expressing sentiment about national government is directly associated with the knowledge that local government does not have full control over its income and expenditure. Clearly, a unitary state needs to be able to control centrally overall expenditure, but the degree to which this is done can be inimical to any federal system. In a federal system, there are federal taxes, but then separately there are state taxes and expenditure. Now, as a young local Brighton councillor, I ploughed my way through the several hundred pages of the report of the Committee on Local Government Finance, whose terms of reference were to review the whole system of local government finance in England, Scotland and Wales, and to make recommendations. The report of the committee, chaired by Sir Frank Layfield QC, was published in May 1976, and an article by Dean Chester in Local Government Studies later that year described it as a document of considerable constitutional importance, being primarily concerned with political accountability in the British system of government. And he states, the Layfield Committee found a lack of clear accountability for local government expenditure, resulting from the present confusion of responsibilities between the government and local authorities. Layfield posed alternative systems, including local income tax. It's interesting that the Scottish Parliament now has and exercises the power to raise additional income tax in Scotland. Yet, as we see in the USA and other examples, there are others which can make a contribution, such as retained business rates and local sales taxes. The Select Committee on the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, Housing, Planning, Local Government and the Regions' 9th report in 2004 reminded us that from the earliest 20th century, central government began to subsidise local authority services by grants or reimbursement of expenditure. After 1945, a significant proportion of the welfare state developed within local government, with a consequent increase in council spending on services such as education, personal social services, and social housing. Layfield led to no reform. The post-1979 Conservative government published a Green Paper in 1981, which considered alternatives to the domestic rates, including a local income tax, local sales tax, and notoriously a poll tax. Once again, no reform occurred. A second consultative paper, published in 1986, proposed the introduction of a poll tax as a replacement for the domestic rate, though it was now renamed the community charge. The charge was introduced in Scotland in 1989 and England and Wales in 1990, and at the same time, the non-domestic rate became a nationally determined assigned revenue. We all know what happened to the poll tax, largely because of its unpopularity, also because it was difficult and expensive to collect. The Select Committee concluded that, and I quote, "the relationship between accountability and the power to raise revenue has been relatively neglected since the Layfield Commission. The Layfield hypothesis suggests that turnout and democratic accountability of local government are crucially affected by the structure of local finance." The Local Government Association also stated that the current local government finance system, whereby local authorities receive 75% of their funding from central government through grants and redistributed business rates, creates a dependency culture, impacts on local government expenditure levels and priorities, and causes disproportionate council tax rises where central government funding is sufficient. Now, matters have not much changed, and any proposal towards a more federal structure of government in the UK must essentially consider the balance in funding and expenditure between central and local government. So far, Whitehall has shown marked reluctance at letting go, which has made the UK arguably, certainly in the old Europe, the most dirigee state of its neighbours. So I end by asking the question, how would a federal United Kingdom look? Well, with a constitutional history that looks like a dog's dinner and has evolved piecemeal and patchwork, you can assume that it would not look neat and uniform. Apart from the financial arrangements to which I've referred, the major problem is a massive imbalance in population and therefore probable influence of England in comparison with Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. The danger is that England would dominate unless there was also a division into English regions, which for certain administrative reasons already exists. It is fair to claim that each part of the UK, to whichever of the four nations it might belong, would certainly fight its corner. The disparate sizes of cantons in the Swiss confederal system, for example, do not seem to have caused much difficulty. And of course, in the USA, each state, whatever its population size, sends 2 senators to Congress, and the number of voting representatives in the House of Representatives as fixed by law at no more than 435, proportionally representing the population of the 50 states. For me, ideally, a federal UK would sit as a member of the wider federation of the EU. In the UK, we are likely to end up with a hodgepodge of metropolitan areas as well as regional councils, in addition to the national assemblies we have at present. And no doubt that itself would involve with trial and error. But if we believe in democratic public involvement in governance as being government of the people, by the people, for the people, then we should be federalists in order that, as President Lincoln said, it shall not perish from the earth. Thank you.